When we talk about humanity and the 20th century, we come back to the enduring force in the story we've been exploring since the beginning of these lectures. We go all the way back to where we begin. And do you know what that force is? Evolution. So much changes in the 20th century, and yet we have to ask ourselves, as we now look at what took place after the First World War, as the world was dealing with the aftermath of that in 1918, and on top of that, an early pandemic in the 20th century, the Spanish influenza epidemic, not quite the pandemic that we have today. We will have to ask ourselves some very important questions about evolution. When we look at the 20th century, there's something we have to address immediately before we continue with the story, and I explore with you today what happened after the First World War, what happened between that war and the Second World War, then, most dramatically, what happened after the Second World War, which was the worst war, the worst conflict, with the highest number of human casualties in any conflict in human history. It's going to raise also a great question too, so there are a lot of questions we're going to look at through today's talk as we move through part 2, the 20th century, and I take you up till the present day. And we're going to conclude the talks today with a return to that great force on planet Earth that has driven all things, all living creatures, all that has happened with human civilization on planet Earth, and that is the force of evolution. So we're going to end there, and I'm going to show you some information, some very good scholarship that should actually, in spite of all that I'm about to show you around genocide, omnicide, difficulties we humans are going to have in this century dealing with our weapons of mass destruction, tools give us so much power, you are going to see something that should give us hope. Something that actually indicates that we humans, in spite of everything you're about to see, are capable of getting better. Let me start with a video that helps us to understand another undercurrent that really emerges in the 20th century that we have to deal with, and that is the exponential growth of human population. And I'd like to narrate this video for you. It comes from the American Museum of Natural History. It's an excellent source, and you will see in the video that it provides a kind of overview of what has been happening with human population on the planet in the last 200,000 years, taking us up till this most dramatic century. So, Cassandra, go ahead and please run human population through time. I want to help you to be able to understand what the video is showing, but it's quite simple. There are a couple of axes here. You'll see on the bottom axis, the horizontal one, we're looking at human population on the planet starting from 100,000 years ago. And we see on the vertical axis what the population was of the planet. And we're talking about pre-civilization here, but anatomical human has emerged. And watch what happens as you remember about the development of agriculture, farming, agriculture, and that led to productivity and growth in societies and population around farmland. Now, here we go again. Horizontal axis. This is the Anno Domini, Jesus of Nazareth has just come into the world. We're using the Christian calendar here. And here comes population again on the vertical axis. And you can see that during this period of the great Han Dynasty and the Roman Empire, and those two empires in Eurasia were somewhat connected in an early Silk Road system. Those were the two great powers, centers of civilization on the planet. And the human population was still around 200, almost 200 million. And we start to see elsewhere in Afro-Eurasia, societies developing, connecting with one another slowly. But we did not have medical science anywhere near what we have today. And child mortality was high. People didn't live as long. Life expectancy was also low. People would live, maybe if they were lucky, to 45, maybe 40. So essentially the population of humans on the planet, in spite of all that was beginning to develop, was still relatively low. And you can see in these little golden circles that are emerging in, you can see India particularly, China around the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, you see in what will eventually become Europe, and of course around the Arabian Peninsula and Northern Africa and the Mediterranean Sea, we're seeing more and more human societies developing. And we're seeing it as well in Western Africa, certainly not much below the Sahara Desert in Africa. And then if you go west across the Atlantic Ocean, and you can see that there's a collection of societies growing around what's now Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula, Gulf of Mexico. But the real development is in, as you know, you've seen this because we've covered this already, of course, it's happening in Eurasia. And gradually, the population is growing. See that in the 1300s, the bubonic plague, which was the most devastating outbreak of infectious disease the world had ever seen to that point, actually impacted the human population quite dramatically, particularly in Europe. About 1/3 to 1/2 of the population killed as a result of that. But just watch. Population is not growing that dramatically yet, even though there's been a lot of human development. It's going to start exponentially growing. See those numbers now flying? See how the axis is starting to move upwards? And we see coming towards the beginning of the 20th century about 1.5 billion humans, and then watch what happens. Century. So, it took 200,000 years for the human population to reach about 1 billion. And then, around the 20th century, just in that period, there's a huge leap. This is what I mean by this exponential, dramatic development we see in the 20th century. In a moment, I'm going to show you another video that can bring to life a little bit more what was beginning to happen at that point, beginning of the 20th century. I'm still reviewing with you a little bit from part one, just to kind of remind you of some of the forces that we're dealing with that are going to play such a role in what's about to come. It took 200,000 years for our population to 1 billion, and 200 years to reach 7 billion. We're living at that moment right now. You and I and Cassandra, who runs all of this, and everyone here who makes this wonderful classroom possible, we're living in a great age of technological, scientific development, a kind of golden age of learning. But we have more humans on this planet in a shorter period of time than we have ever seen. So let's go to another video for a moment, just to give you a sense of the people that were emerging. And as Cassandra is teeing up the video that will show you some remarkable scenes of ordinary life in France at the turn of the century, I just like to reinforce this idea for you, in part because I want to prepare you for the dark content that's about to come, which does require a trigger warning for some of you who may be having difficulty dealing with some of the graphic images I will show. But before I do that, I just want to remind you that we are living right now in 2021 in a golden age of learning. Why do I say that? Well, the video I'm about to show you is remarkable because it's essentially the result of a young filmmaker who posted online very early films that were made of ordinary life when motion pictures were just developing at the beginning of the 20th century. And what this young filmmaker has done is he's worked hard with his machine learning and his tools and his access to knowledge online to colorize the film, to bring it to the proper speed at 60 frames per second, so that instead of us looking at a really old, broken up black and white film, we actually can go back now and get a feeling through the technology that has been applied to this film and the inspiration of this filmmaker. We can get a greater feeling of being connected to the people who were living at the beginning of this remarkable century. Cassandra, please go ahead and run this video. And I'll walk you through it a little bit so you know what you're looking at. But you will immediately, when you see this, begin to... Sound effects have been also put in. Some very subtle and realistic sound effects have been embedded into this. But here we are in Lyon, France in 1895. Look at these people, just like you and me. Real people going through their lives. Of course, no cars, carriages, horses. But this is an example of growing human societies, a growing human population on this planet. I love this one. The dog comes in and we get the bark, and then there's a woman who's going to run out here for a moment, and there's a man kind of chasing a little bit or doing something, if I remember correctly, and she giggles. At any rate, these are just ordinary French people going about their day, coming off a boat, and there's a bicycle. And you will see in these videos that the men all wear hats, and whenever they see the camera, oh yeah, there's the guy with the newspaper. Wait, whenever they see the camera, which would have been quite something for them to see, they'll tip their hats. So elegant. Look at the dress. Pipes. Everybody's looking at the camera. I've never seen anything like this. So it's important for them. There's the tip of the hat. Hello? Hello? 1995, you are watching people come off a boat in France. I'm going to show you a couple more minutes of this, just to help you understand something about, first, the number of people that we're seeing in our cities more and more, and great. Cold people moving away from this. This could be today in 2021 a spaceship at NASA, but this was a huge ship. And the filmmaker who's done this has very artfully and skillfully inserted some realistic sounds. Bring us back to that. This is history. Here we have a festival in France that was supposed to replicate Swiss Village Cultural Festival. The music, here's the one thing I love, cows. You're going to hear a hand just sort of gently touch the cow and pat the cow. Why do I want to focus on the cow? Because I want to remind you about something. Do you know how much of human civilization has been built and continues to be built on the backs and the udders and the meat of these amazing creatures that have given so much to us? Cow. Finally, Westminster Bridge in London. You'll hear Big Ben ringing. Of course, there's another man looking at the camera. Hats, the bowler hats. See him, young man looking, carrying his umbrella. This is 1900. This is 121 years ago. And I hope, as you watch this, that you can feel a little bit of what I'm feeling as I narrate it. These are people who lived here on this planet, who are part of this great century, like you and me, much different in many ways. When we talk about the 20th century, we're talking about so many things: human population, the growth of science and technology. And you just saw there, for example, in a very kind of ordinary way, the introduction of the motion picture camera. Think of how important the camera is in our lives today. And there you saw one of the first uses of a camera, very likely using film or celluloid, that Thomas Edison had developed in his industrial laboratory. Well, let's start by reminding you of where we were at the end of part one. With people actually in Canada, in Saskatchewan, a province of Canada, not too far from where I am standing right now in Ontario, province of Canada, and I'm just not far from Toronto in the Centre for Collaborative Education, Global Classroom at Durham College. Look at this in 2021. I'm standing here with you, and our assistant Cassandra, who runs all of this, is over there on the podium, and we're both wearing masks. These people were among the luckier ones of the Spanish influenza crisis of 1918 that eventually killed more people than the two world wars. I'd like to just remind you of something that maybe is not immediately apparent to you as I now really begin to tell you what happened after this period as we move toward the present day. And that is a question I'd like to ask. How different is it now? And how different might it be in the years to come than it was for those people who were wearing the same sorts of face covering that Cassandra and I are wearing in 2021? In other words, the millions around the world who suffered through the Spanish influenza pandemic may have lived 103 years ago. 2021 as I stand here, 1918 as you look at this picture. But what is really different? Has anything really changed? Is anything really going to change? What exactly has been happening to the human race? Are we evolving? Are we getting anywhere? Is humanity learning? Are we just going sideways and backwards? Or are we actually advancing? Is there something called progress that's taking place on this planet? I'm going to try and answer that for you in the final part of the 20th century. I'm going to start with something a little bit depressing, a little bit dark, to help you to understand that in this century, we saw reemerging with a greater cost now, this idea of a kind of strong man. Religion is sort of taken out of this equation a little bit, and it's not like we're dealing anymore with a God king. We're dealing with a new modern idea that is still very much about a strong authoritarian figure taking charge. And we call it totalitarianism. Totalitarianism. I'll let Cassandra work on that. It's a lot of syllables. It's a big mouthful. But after the First World War, we saw emerge, in part as a result of the conditions that were imposed on Germany at the end of the First World War, but as a result of other developments taking place, it led to a new system of governance, a new system of human engineering, in which we saw emerge in Germany, of course, with Adolf Hitler. We saw it emerge with Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. We saw it emerge in Italy with Benito Mussolini. And we certainly saw it emerge in Spain with the General Federico Franco, the longest reigning general and tyrant of the 20th century. This ideology called totalitarianism, which will combine the strong man and authoritarian government with the aggressive use of technology to control populations, will now become a very diabolical and difficult force for humanity to deal with. Let us remember that these men, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Benito Mussolini, and General Franco of Spain, almost all of them came to power because they were elected, because we people voted for them. Let me show you how this begins to play out and how this leads to what we will see in the Second World War, which is a genocide and an omnicide on the scale that has never happened in human history. And it will be all enabled by technology and science. They were not the only authoritarian figures to emerge after the First World War. China also saw the emergence of Mao Zedong, another strong authoritarian figure leading his people in a state that was so aggressively controlled by a central government, and in which the people of that state were supposed to be so obedient to their leader, their dear leader, that they would be even expected to spy on their own family. and to turn in their brothers or their sisters or their mothers or their fathers if those people did not adhere to the totalitarian ideology. We had seen this kind of centralized, overwhelming control in human history, in other societies. You've seen this. But the difference now is the way that these authoritarian figures use technology to control populations and try to engineer kind of utopian societies. This is a very disturbing thing. We see somewhat the results of this today in 2021. You're going to see a story shortly of how we were able to confront this threat to humanity. But if you would like to understand a little bit about how this force remains in 2021, take a look at North Korea today. This is a society so walled off from the world, ruled by a family whose only real claim to any kind of guidance for the population is to control the military, is to build up nuclear weapons, is to threaten the rest of the world with these weapons, but keep the rest of the world out. Wall North Korea off to the rest of the world. This is what totalitarian regimes do. They build walls, and they declare that their people are the best. And they must be all protected with the weapons of mass destruction. We see this today, almost comically, in Russia. Vladimir Putin, the current leader of Russia, has made it very clear in the propaganda that he issues to the people that he is a very strong man who will protect them. He likes to show himself as the black belt in karate that apparently he is. He likes to play hockey with the other great Russian hockey players who give him the ice so that he can score his goals, and he can look like he is the person who can do everything and protect everybody. And I just want to remind you of how this threat, this totalitarian threat, is something we have to deal with today. Vladimir Putin and the current Chinese premier, who is like Mao Zedong, they are the only two leaders in the world of great powers. China today, Russia today, in which one of those leaders has now been given power for life. That's Premier Xi in China. He now will be in power for as long as he wants. He has requested that from his Congress in Beijing, and they gave it to him. And as I stand here today, Vladimir Putin is asking to do the very same thing. He wants to have power for life, and he will receive it very likely. So when we talk about totalitarianism, we have to understand that, like slavery, like the great forces that we've looked at in this course so far, freedom, evolution, exploration, the desire for knowledge, there is also this force that we must contend with again and again, and it is difficult for us. And here it is. It is the force not strictly of religion in the God-King idea of it. It's the force of a strong, male, authoritarian figure who will take care of us. As if we are kind of like children and we need a strong father. We want a strong father to protect us. But then here's where it gets very nasty. And I'm now going to take you back to the Second World War and help you to understand this concept that will require a little trigger warning for all of you now, because I'm going to show you some pretty dark things, and that is genocide. Imagine when a totalitarian leader emerges who says that he is going to save us and make us strong, and then he says, well, there are people we must get rid of who are a threat to us, who are making our society weak. We, the great people, we must rise and we must eliminate those who somehow are weakening our society. And they're not really human. They're kind of savage. They're sort of parasites. We have to get rid of them. You will start to understand something about what took place in Germany in the Second World War. It led to what we call the Holocaust, which was an orchestrated genocide of an entire civilization of people. I'm about to show you how that happened. You will start to understand why it's not just about Germany. Because in the 20th century, do you know how many other genocides we began to see? The attempt by one civilization of people to use modern technology and weapons of mass destruction to liquidate, make disappear, destroy their enemies forever. It took place in China. Belgium did it with the many Africans in the Congo. The Soviet Union attempted to do it with its own people. Japan, Turkey, Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Darfur, Kurdistan, Sri Lanka, Guatemala, Armenia. Why, after all that we know in the human story about our attempt to rule others so cruelly, why would we not learn? Why would we not be able to recognize that genocide combined with technology is a place we do not want to go, human being? Well, let's take a look at 39, 45, Second World War. Adolf Hitler, the leader of Nazi Germany, the National Socialists, had come to power, elected by the people, with his promise that he would make Germany strong again after its defeat in the First World War. And his enemy, that he promised he would eliminate, that he said to the German people, were the drain on the great German Aryan race, were the Jews. But not just the Jews, people of color, people with mental health conditions, anybody who really wasn't white, blue-eyed, and Aryan, were people that Hitler and the German people who elected him wanted out of their society. And not just out, but destroyed. You may think in the Second World War, when we look at the legacy of genocide that came out of it, that it was not possible for human beings to orchestrate the scale of death on this level. Just the way some of you who remember what happened on September the 11th, 2001, may wonder, how is it really possible that these buildings in New York could be brought down by young men in airplanes? It couldn't have been planned out quite like that. There must be some sort of conspiracy, something else behind this, because something so terrible could not be carried out intentionally by humans, could it? And there are some of you who may think 6 million Jews, Second World War, just killed? That's not possible to kill so many people so quickly on that scale. It couldn't have been planned out. It must have been sort of just an accident or not quite intended. It just, humans don't go there. Well, we did. And you're looking at how we did it. It happened in a place called Wannsee, just outside Berlin. The Second World War, after Hitler had invaded many European nations and was occupying them, even France, Nazis were in France, and Hitler even went to the Eiffel Tower, and it looked like the Vichy government, the Nazi government in France, would remain. And it really did look like Germany could win the war. So powerful was their military machine. Hitler was on his way to the Soviet Union to do what Napoleon could not even do, and that was invade, attack, and occupy the great Soviet Union, the great Russia. So at this moment in the war, Hitler tasked a series of his senior figures to meet at a guest house at a place called Wannsee, just outside of Berlin. As I show you what happened, and a documentary about this, as well as some of the evidence, you're going to see some images that are very shocking. And I hope that for some of you who can't believe that it's possible for humans to plan out the systematic, industrial scale murder that was carried out, you will begin to see that it is possible. And it is possible not by people who are diabolical and mad and mentally disturbed, but normal people, lawyers and accountants, and ordinary people, your neighbors, your family. It's called the banality of evil. Hannah Arendt, the banality of evil. Would you like to see the banality of evil, the ordinariness of evil play out, and how this can happen? Well, I'm going to show you a scene or two from a German docudrama that used the evidence that was collected from this 90-minute conference. That's all it was, a 90-minute conference. It took place in Wannsee in secret, at the height of the Second World War, where Hitler asked his senior figures to plan out the final solution. The final solution meaning, how do we finally deal with our great enemy, Jew? How do we get rid of them? How do we kill them all? Let's watch this.
On Tuesday, January 20th, 1942, at a house in the quiet Berlin suburb Wannsee, a meeting was held. At the invitation of Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Security Police and Secret Service, 14 key representatives of the Nazi Party, of the SS, and of the government bureaucracy attended. The meeting lasted just 90 minutes. There was only one item on the agenda.
Hi, Lisa.
Eitler.
now going to go inside the conference room as the senior figures are now about to learn what exactly Hitler would like them. Go ahead.
Aber die Tatsache, dass wir uns hier und heute getroffen haben, mag doch immerhin unseren guten Willen bekunden. Was haben Sie denn mit ihm angestellt?
Ich habe ihn mit auf Verpflegung gesetzt. Ist ja alles da hier.
Dog needed to eat.
Zu den Berliner Juden. Wieso glauben die uns nicht, wenn wir ihnen sagen, ihr kommt da im Osten zum Arbeitseinsatz? Wissen die tatsächlich, was sie dort erwartet?
Würden Sie sonst aus dem Fenster springen oder den Gashahn aufdrehen?
Ja, was sagen dazu die Nachbarn, die Bekannten, die Freunde? Was für ein Gerede, um Gottes Willen.
Ein Grund mehr, die ganze Angelegenheit au tempo aus der Welt zu schaffen.
Das wäre zu wünschen. Die Judenselbstmorde in Berlin haben auch uns im Auswärtigen Amt einige Kopfschmerzen gemacht. Sie wurden von der Auslandspresse nicht übersehen. Es gab auch andere Probleme. Zum Beispiel Mitnahme von Juden mit ausländischem Pass. Das können wir uns nicht leisten.
Wo gehobelt wird, fallen Späne.
Das sagen Sie meinem Botschafter.
Wir werden das abstellen.
Dann aber bitte auch, dass vereinzelt auch Judenmischlinge und solche aus Mischehen in die Aktionen mit einbezogen werden, wie es ja wohl irrtümlicherweise geschehen ist, was von Seiten des Innenministers sehr bedauert wird.
Das sind Anlaufpannen, die selbstverständlich nicht vorkommen sollten, Kamerad Müller.
Schon Vorsorge getroffen.
Wenn wir schon dabei sind.
Na, das kann ja heiter werden.
Der Reichsmarschall selbst in seiner Eigenschaft als Vierjahresplaner moniert den Abschub auch von Rüstungsfacharbeitern und lässt ausrichten, so habe man aber nicht gewettet.
Also ich stelle fest, meine Herren, dass Herr Reichsmarschall in seiner einen Eigenschaft bedauert, was er in einer anderen begrüßt. Sie sehen, meine Herren, die Probleme liegen nicht so einfach, besonders nicht, wenn Kompetenzen kollidieren. Es ist deshalb von entscheidender Bedeutung, dass hier und jetzt Klarheit geschaffen wird über die Frage der Federführung. Wir alle wissen doch, dass in unserem guten Berlin seit eh und je nichts schwieriger ist als eine Einigung über Zuständigkeiten. Ich weiß wirklich nicht, warum Sie hier immer alle Leute darum reißen, unbedingt zuständig zu sein, was hier schließlich und endlich bedeutet, zuständig für mehr Arbeit. Aber das ist ja wohl ein deutsches Erbübel.
Tugend, Obergruppenführer.
Geschenkt. Also Scherz beiseite, meine Herren. Ich erkläre kategorisch Federführung ausschließlich und unwiderruflich und ohne Abstriche beim Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler und mit dessen Vollmacht bei meiner bescheidenen Wenigkeit.
Es liegt aber nichts Schriftliches vor.
Von wem?
Von der Hand des Führers.
Dass Maßnahmen von solcher Tragweite nicht ohne vorherige Genehmigung zu treffen sein werden, das versteht sich ja von selbst.
Das Wort des Führers wiegt alles Papier auf.
Im Übrigen, wenn Sie mir am Ende dieser Sitzung sonst jemanden nennen können, der in der Lage ist, die vorhergesehene Lösung praktisch, ich betone praktisch, durchzuführen und dazu noch in geordneter und anständiger Weise, dann wäre ich der Erste, der sagen würde, bitte, bitte nach Ihnen.
Obergruppenführer, wir haben im Generalgouvernement 2,5 Millionen Juden. Ein erstrangiges und komplexes Problem in ehemals Polen. Werde ich dem Generalgouverneur zu melden haben, dass man ihm auf diesem Sektor, wie er es ausdrücken würde, hineinzuregieren gedenkt?
Aber wir werden doch nicht in Ihr Problem hineinregieren, Herr Staatssekretär. Wir werden es Ihnen vom Halse schaffen. Das wird sich sehr schnell im Wohlgefallen auflösen und Sie werden uns am Ende dafür dankbar sein.
Ihre Federführung gilt also für den gesamten Bereich der Zivilverwaltungen im Osten.
Richtig. Wobei allerdings sichergestellt werden muss, dass der Wille zur Zusammenarbeit gegenseitig ist. Hören Sie noch zu, Sturmbannführer?
Stop for a second. Cassandra, I'd like to just address, and then we're going to come back and finish the video. You're looking at educated, trained, often lawyers, they were, these senior figures, who are part of a great historical culture of the German people. They are sitting around a boardroom table, having a discussion, it would seem, about a strategy that could be for anything so ordinary. I want to remind you that they're talking about how they're going to kill millions of people. And isn't it interesting? This is based on a transcript that we have of this event, so this is not made up that I'm showing you. The actual order from Hitler was never fully written because the German leadership did not want this to be fully ordered. They never want the people to know, ever, history, ever. There was a record in which a final solution was actually ordered. Nonetheless, they all know what they're being asked to do. And they're also being told not to say anything as well. So what you're seeing is humans knowing that what they're doing is wrong. But they're going to do it anyways. Cassandra, go back.
Jawohl!
Naja, um Missverständnissen vorzubeugen, der Herr Generalgouverneur ist durchaus kein Gegner eines rücksichtslosen Durchgreifens, weder in der Polen- noch in der Judenfrage. Wie Ihnen der Befehlshaber der Sicherheitspolizei und des SD im Gouvernement sicher gern bestätigt.
Ja.
Das Problem ist nur, schließlich hat man ihm erst unlängst im Ostministerium den, ich weiß nicht, ironischen Rat gegeben, liquidiert Sie selber.
Es ging darum, ob wir ihm oben im Ostland Juden abnehmen könnten. Wir können das nicht. Wir haben immer noch zu viele, trotz der Arbeit der Einsatzkommandos.
Naja, es ist nicht so, als würde der Herr Generalgouverneur einer endgültigen Bereinigung der Frage reserviert gegenüberstehen. Im Gegenteil. Auf einer letzten Besprechung vor meiner Herreise betonte er nochmals nachdrücklich seine Bereitschaft, das Gouvernement Juden reinzumachen. Und zwar, wie er sagte, im Zusammenhang mit den vom Reich her zu beschließenden großen Maßnahmen. Es gehe darum, dieser außergewöhnlich großen Zahl von schädlichen Fressern, wie er drastisch formulierte, in Polen Herr zu werden. Es ist also eine Frage der Maßnahmen.
Genau das ist es, meine Herren. Wir haben die Frage der Maßnahmen beantwortet und deshalb sind wir hier. Wir haben die Mittel, die Methoden, die Organisation, die Erfahrung und die Menschen und wir haben die Entschlossenheit. Nun, meine Herren, wir befinden uns heute in einem historischen Augenblick unseres Kampfes gegen das Judentum. 4-mal hat der Führer über den Reichsdeutschen Rundfunk seinen Willen bekundet, die jüdische Schuld am deutschen Volke mit der Vernichtung des Judentums in Europa zu ahnden. Der Führer sieht sich als ein Robert Koch der Politik, der den tödlichen Bacillus ausrottet, um den Organismus zu retten. Sie oder wir, das ist die Frage. Nun, was ist bisher geschehen? Lassen Sie mich kurz rekapitulieren. Wir haben die Juden A durch das umfassende Judengesetzgebungswerk, vornehmlich des Innenministeriums, Stück für Stück und unbarmherzig aus allen Lebensgebieten des deutschen Volkes hinausgedrängt.
If you would like to watch this complete meeting, I highly recommend the Wannsee Conference. You will see the discussion unfold when the actual meticulous planning begins to take place on how this initiative, if you will, is going to be executed. I'm going to show you what happened. I'm also going to show you some evidence. Here. Call this Exhibit A. These are records from the meeting at Wannsee of the individuals who were present. And you can see on the page opposite to all of the individuals, senior Nazi leadership, a list of the countries which Germany had either begun to occupy or planned to occupy, and then you will see a number. The accountants are planning out how many Jews and so-called undesirables exist in those countries, and how many they really will have to deal with in the end if they want to clean away the parasites from these societies. That is not my word. Parasite is a word that you just heard. It's in the transcripts from Wannsee. I ask you, do you think there is any human being in your life, no matter how reprehensible you may think they are, who deserves to be called a parasite? Well, if you look at this record, Go down to the bottom at that number, and you will see 11 million. Thanks, Cassandra. Just pan over. There it is. They were going after 11 million. They got 6 million. This is the shocking part. For some of you who can't get your mind around the fact that 6 million Jews were killed. No. They were going after more. And they would have succeeded had they won the war. Hitler, in the end, would take his own life in a bunker in Berlin. He would kill himself. He would have no choice. The Western powers, England, United States, Canada, others, would defeat Germany and win the war. But can you imagine? 11 million. How would this actually be carried out? Well, here's the part that I just want to warn you. You're about to see some shocking images. The reason I'm showing you this, and I must show you this, is because you need to understand that humans, trained, educated humans from great cultures, are capable of going there if they allow themselves to. This is what the Nazi regime orchestrated with modern technology. Through the Second World War, as they were gradually winning the war, those officials that you just saw, guided by the Führer, Adolf Hitler, and others who were carrying out his policies, had a very well-engineered plan of genocide. And that is, you take trains. Trains, a modern source of transportation, with the rail networks that had been built, that were the foundation of the Industrial Revolution. And instead of putting goods and animals on the trains, you put people. Put all these people into boxcars and freight trains, get them into these trains, and move these trains 24/7, all the way to what essentially were factories of mass slaughter. Here, in these death camps, where these people were brought to, well, I think you know how to fill in some of the details on this, because some of you know this story already, but let me just give you some of the principal features of it. You take a new kind of gas, Zyklon B, which the Nazis had already tested out in trucks before they had used trains. They had actually been gassing people in small trucks. They would come into communities. They would, at right at the point of a rifle, people would be brought to the trucks. Great fear, not knowing where they're going, and as a test, the Nazis would put them in trucks, gas them inside, bury the people, and gradually they began to learn that Zyklon B was a very effective way of killing people quickly. So gradually the plan emerged, in part, as a result of what happened at Wannsee, that you bring people to these camps built in the boondocks, if you will, places that are far away from human societies, so that people really won't know what's happening, but even if they did find out, probably they would never believe it. We get this in the Wannsee Conference. The figures actually will say at one point, if this gets out and the world knows, most people would never even believe this could happen. Imagine that. They knew that most of us don't have the imagination. Most of us are too naive to think that humans are capable of doing this. They took advantage of our ignorance. You bring them, millions and millions, You put them into big chambers underground. You fill those chambers up with gas. You kill lots of people 24/7, take their bodies out, you burn them, and you have very little left to bury. But if those death camps could not keep up with the numbers of people who were being brought in and could not be put into these chambers or burned, then you just take the bodies, strip them, put them into pits, gun them all down, and then put lots of earth over them. The Nazis aren't the only ones who did this. We have lots of evidence from other societies in the 20th century who did the very same thing. Just take lots of people, line them up, kill them, then put soil over them, and eventually nobody will see these bodies ever again. I wish I could tell you that the genocide that was carried out in the Second World War by a nation that was eventually defeated is all there really is to tell you about the darkest and most significant legacy that we must deal with going forwards. But genocide is not. There's something else. It's called omnicide. This is the greatest threat that we must contend with, and really presents a kind of dividing line between the world before the Second World War and the world after. All this, the atomic age that we live in now, large part because of what happened in the Second World War. You're looking at a piece of uranium. Uranium is a natural material that is found in quite significant abundance in the Congo, Central Africa, a place that the Belgians had gone to secure many slaves, a part of the world that has a lot of great natural materials, ivory, rubber, uranium. Why am I telling you about uranium suddenly? Well, near the end of the Second World War, Albert Einstein reemerges in our story. Remember Albert Einstein, the great mind who helps us to see natural forces like we haven't before. He and his scientific colleagues in Europe had learned how to do something that had never been done before. Split the atom. It's called nuclear fission. Split the atom, and when you do that, you release unimaginable sources of energy. During the Second World War, when these scientists discovered this new natural power, they were profoundly worried that it would fall into Hitler's hands. And they also understood that this power, called nuclear fission, can be replicated by humans, and the process can be actually developed to replicate it with uranium. So in order to create an atomic weapon that will release energy in a way it has never been released before, you need a ready supply of uranium. Albert Einstein and others understood this. The question was, what do they do with their knowledge? This is a letter that Albert Einstein wrote, the Second World War, to the American president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. This is an actual copy. Very famous letter. Here is the world's most celebrated scientist who has just discovered a new source of power that humans have created by manipulating nature again. This is fire again. This is Prometheus again. Imagine. And he said in this letter, Mr. President, we are concerned that Hitler could acquire this knowledge and use it. We would like you to have this. He brought this knowledge to the American president. You can imagine, during the war, what the American leadership was now beginning to think. They were not yet in the war, but they were assisting Britain. They were assisting other Europeans with the war. But Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, was on the phone constantly to the American president, requesting his assistance to get ready to invade the mainland of Europe, because Hitler had bombed London, had sent planes in, and Churchill and the British fully understood the threat that the Nazis presented, and they required American assistance. Eventually, the Americans had no choice, because the Japanese, who had their own tyrant, their own dictator in the form of their emperor, who also believed in the supremacy of the Japanese race, just the way the Germans had believed in the supremacy of their race, and Japan had invaded China, had invaded other countries in the Far East, and now they sent pilots, suicidal pilots, kamikaze pilots across the Pacific Ocean. And they all bombed the American ships at Pearl Harbor. And they drew the United States into the war. Well, it wasn't long before the Americans began a research program underneath a football field at the University of Chicago. You're looking at it right now, Stagg Field. And underneath this field, unknown to anybody at that time, there were nuclear physicists and scientists working on how they could take the knowledge that Einstein had brought to them and create an atomic weapon. Underneath a football field, there they were. They created it. 2 great atomic weapons. Guess what? They were used in order to send a very clear signal to the Japanese that the United States would not stand for the escalation of the war to this degree, that they would never stand to be attacked on their own soil at Pearl Harbor, at their military base. They made it very clear to the Japanese and to the emperor that if Japan did not surrender, they would unleash a new form of destruction on them that would be total annihilation. This is what we call omnicide, the destruction of everything. I want to remind you that we're still only talking about the 1940s here. In terms of the release of energy that you're about to see with the dropping of the bomb, 2 bombs on Japan, to pummel them into surrender. This was many decades ago. Can you imagine today what's at our disposal in terms of nuclear power? Just hold that thought in your mind. We humans are now entering a place that we have never. And that is the ability, with our own weapons of mass destruction, destroy life itself. Well, I want to help you to understand what happened. And again, this gets graphic, but it's important that you understand because you need to know truth, to the best of our knowledge, of what happens to humanity when we allow ourselves to use our weapons and we have not solved our social or moral dilemmas. If we haven't solved those dilemmas and we have new weapons, then what history becomes is a constantly repeating series of conflicts. And the only thing that changes, cost goes up, the price goes up, the scale of destruction goes up. That's a lesson from history that is stark but important to understand. In 1945, August the 6th, August the 9th, not so long after Pearl Harbor had been bombed and many Americans had been killed, the first bomb, atomic bomb, was dropped in the morning, August the 6th, on Hiroshima. I'm going to read you something that a reporter wrote at the time. And then I'm going to show you some witnesses, survivors, who went through this event, real people. We're going to run that video. But let me just help you to understand some facts. When the first atomic bomb fell out of the sky and fell onto Hiroshima, or Hiroshima, Japan, August the 6th, 1945. This was after the Japanese emperor had been warned repeatedly that the attack was coming. But there was no response from the emperor. And the humiliation for an emperor, a god king, for the Japanese to have to deal with an emperor coming out and accepting surrender was too great. It was very much like Atahualpa on his litter, 1532, in Peru, who is brought down by the Spanish, and he is being seen by the thousands of Inca warriors as a mortal man, capable of surrender, no longer a god. The emperor knew as soon as he had to say that to the Japanese people, that I surrender, he's no longer a god. He's just a man. Well, had he maybe accepted the conditions of defeat, there might not have been this moment. There was. August the 6th, 1945, in the morning. Here's what the reporter wrote after when he came to the scene, Hiroshima. We saw Hiroshima today, or what little is left of it. We were so shocked with what we saw that most of us felt like weeping, not out of sympathy for the Japs, but because we were shocked and revolted by this new and terrible form of destruction. Compared to Hiroshima, Berlin and Hamburg and Cologne are practically untouched. Those were the German cities that were bombed by the Allies. What was formerly Japan's most modern, most westernized city is now nothing more than a 2-foot layer of twisted tin and rubble. As you stand in the middle of this 4 1/10 square miles of flattened ruin, gaunt, blackened, twisted trees give the picture of Hiroshima its only source of elevation. Only 10 steel frame buildings still stand, but there is nothing left of them too. They're just blackened hollow shells. You know that when the bomb fell and finally collided, with Earth in a matter of seconds. Bodies were immediately broken and flew, body parts, 1,000 miles an hour. Other bodies were thrust up against walls and they were vaporized there. In other words, the body disappeared from the atomic energy, but a ghosted image still remained on the wall of the body. 140,000 were killed in Hiroshima from the blast, 1/3 of the city's population. 69% of the buildings were completely destroyed. I could give you more facts like this. And the same thing is about to happen in a moment, just a few days later, on August the 9th, in Nagasaki. Because after this moment in Hiroshima, the Japanese emperor still would not surrender. So the Americans dropped another bomb on Nagasaki. And finally, the emperor came out and accepted defeat. Let's talk about the real people now and what they went through, what they witnessed, what this was like to be part of this moment in history. Cassandra, can you please run the video on survivors? This comes from the Smithsonian Institute, a very good source of information.
It was so dark because of the smoke and dust being sucked up in the mushroom cloud, and the ghostly procession. I say ghostly because they just didn't look like human beings. Their hair was just all standing up toward the sky. They were burned and blackened and swollen. Parts of the bodies were missing, and they were covered with blood, and clothes were tattered, and the flesh and skin hanging from their bones.
Yoshiaka stumbles to the door of the communications bunker. Climbing on top of the bunker, she is stunned to discover her city in ruins.
There was a soldier on the ground suffering from burns. I thought, there's someone on the ground, and ran towards him. He noticed me and said, half groaning, "We've been hit by a new type of bomb. A new type of bomb."
A local photographer finds a huddle of burned people on the morning of August 6th, trying to soothe their wounds with cooking oil. After seeing his classmates consumed by fire, 7-year-old Takashi Tanamori is pulled from the ruins of his burning school by a soldier and carried into the city.
There was a man, I think he was a man, unrecognizably burned, scarred, and marred. You can't tell it, but I knew that was a man. He said to soldiers who's clutching me in his arm, he said, "Water, water, please, water." And the soldier just...
"11-year-old Tetsushi Yonezawa and his mother are only 750 yards from ground zero, shielded in a crowded tram. All the other passengers are killed by the blast.
My mother and I were surrounded by people, so we were uninjured. I knocked my head and got shards of glass in my hair, but at that time I didn't notice them. My mother grabbed my hand and said, 'Are you all right, Tetsushi?' When I replied that I was okay, she said that we should get off the tram.
Yoshiaka returns to her post in the communications bunker. desperate to send out the news of what has happened in Hiroshima. She finds one working phone and reaches an officer in regional headquarters.
I said, yes, the whole of Hiroshima has been annihilated. The person at the other end said, I don't understand what you are saying. What do you mean, annihilated? As I thought about how I could possibly make him understand, I remembered what the soldier on the embankment said. We've been hit by a new type of bomb. So I said to him, we've been hit by a new type of bomb.
Genocide, homicide, and the Second World War. Maybe we can now start to understand why I call this. Also remember, totalitarian nations precipitate this war. Nations that came together that adhere to constitutional self-government, liberty, rights. They were the victors. However, we cannot ever overlook the scale of destruction and the cost that it took to win this war. And this is really why we say that at the end of the Second World War in 1945, humanity was coming to another reckoning. Something had to change. In the same way that Bartolomé Las Casas understood something about the conquest, and in the same way that we say 1500 is a kind of dividing line, so was 1945. And I actually have, after all of this, some interesting news for you. We had to ask ourselves the question collectively. The victors who came together, the United Nations, that was formed out of the Second World War, even those in defeat who had lost so much and who sought to redress the injustices they felt were continuing against them, even they had to ask themselves the question, what now? Where does humanity go now? You know where it went? We got this for the first time ever in human history. The United Nations, which was a much stronger international institution in its early days, the end of the Second World War, created this declaration. Now, for the first time, we did not just have democratic constitutions that had been developed Western world. You saw the American Revolution, French Revolution, revolutions in the Americas, the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture fighting for the rights, the dignity of the slaves and defeating Napoleon. We see now a universal declaration of human rights. Article number 1. It says the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. It is now the most translated document in human history, available in something like 500 languages. No matter how cynical you may be in 2021, to say that this document has no value anymore, this document still exists. It was put together. It was written down. It was agreed upon by the General Assembly of the United Nations at the end of the Second World War. And here's what it said. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. So now we have, after all of that, a kind of statement at last of the obvious. You know that it was Canada, to some extent, that helped to write the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was the American president's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was very much involved, and so were Canadians. John Humphreys, a Canadian diplomat, who helped to write the first drafts of the Universal Declaration. And then we had a Canadian Prime Minister who was very involved in the United Nations in the early years, Lester B. Pearson, and he won a Nobel Prize for his efforts at peace. His efforts at creating a modern nation, Canada, that respected gender equality, respected the rights of all peoples, that provided accessible education and healthcare, and essentially was a testament to the new and what we hope would be enduring power of human rights in the human story. We even saw some remarkable figures emerge that attempted to unite long-standing grievances. In India, for example, Mahatma Gandhi, who galvanized support for a united India in which Muslims and Hindus could live together under one nation. Gandhi, here are his 7 sins. I love this. Politics without principle. Wealth without work. Commerce without morality. Pleasure without conscience. Education without character. Science without humanity. Worship without sacrifice. This humble man was saying to the world, we, the Indian people, will rule ourselves. The British should leave. Hindus and Muslims can live together, and we can create a modern nation. He was assassinated by a fanatic, a Hindu fanatic. But you see, the idea of human rights that Gandhi was championing, and so many others were and will continue to in the post-war period, this is now going to become an important part of the human story. So much so that we're going to avoid a third world war. You see, in the years after the Second World War, when we began to see this newfound celebration of human rights, the two allies in the Second World War that had helped to defeat Hitler, the United States and the Soviet Union, they now became enemies again. Just the way Sparta and Athens had come together to fight off the Persians during the Persian Wars. And then after they defeated them, they fell into a war themselves, the Peloponnesian War, that eventually ended in Athens' defeat. There was the Soviet Union, which was a communist nation with its communist smaller satellite powers, and there was the United States, a capitalist, sort of free market, democratic nation, and all of its allies. And both of those empires had nuclear weapons, and both of them were testing them repeatedly. Not just atomic bombs, but now an even greater power, the hydrogen bomb, which can cause even greater destruction. And during the 1950s, there was increasingly a Cold War developing between these two great empires, these post-war empires, the communist world and the capitalist democratic world. And had you been a young student, those days you would have been used to drills repeatedly, where you would be asked to go under your desk to be ready for the bombs that are coming from the Soviet Union, the nuclear bombs that are coming that will begin World War III. And it truly did look like there was going to be a Third World War. But there wasn't. There's a fascinating story to be told about how in 1962 the Americans discovered that the Soviets had nuclear missiles parked in Cuba with warheads on them, ready to be launched against the Americans. And it seemed like for 13 days in 1962 that there was going to be a Third World War that would break out between the communist East and the capitalist democratic West. And for those 13 days, when the Americans discovered those warheads and were determining what to do, and there was the kind of most dramatic global brinksmanship unfolding as the American president, John F. Kennedy, and the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, were deciding whether they would begin an actual conflict against one another that would escalate into a nuclear war. Would these two men be able to de-escalate this? Well, they did. But it wasn't just because of them. I'd like to introduce you to another one of those courageous free thinkers in our story who often emerge and do extraordinary things, and we sometimes don't remember who they were because so much of history is told about the people in the highest levels of power. But Vasily Arkhipov, during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, was the commander of the 4 Russian submarines that actually carried nuclear-tipped torpedoes on the submarines, and he had been instructed to move across the ocean, Atlantic Ocean, remain right outside, very close to American soil, and be prepared to launch those missiles if he were instructed to. He was also told that if communication with Moscow had broken down and he had no way of accessing his instructions, he could decide what to do himself, make that order himself. In other words, this young commander of 4 submarines was now carrying with him the awesome responsibility of whether, if he is under attack, he should launch those torpedoes with nuclear missiles on them at the United States and the Americas. For 5 days, as his submarines remained off the coast in the Atlantic Ocean, just miles away from Florida and Cuba, and with his ability to launch those torpedoes, and for 5 days as he was receiving all of these weapons that were being dropped from American boats, trying to pull him up from his submarine to surrender. He was under constant threat from American attack. And he even had his own commanders around him who were pushing him to launch these missiles. And he never did. Chose not to. He chose ultimately to go back to Moscow, and there he was treated as an enemy of the state for many decades. Today we consider him a hero for what he did, but at that time he was considered a traitor because he refused to attack when he himself was under attack. It is people like that in our story who have made the decision to prevent greater destruction for humanity. And these are people who have the free moral conscience. that even though they have been commanded to act in a way that they are told will protect their people, they still, in the heat of the moment, choose to think for themselves. The free thinkers, those who act with their conscience, no matter what the pressure is, no matter what they're being told. These are the ones who are emerging recently, in the latter part of the 20th century, as humans, literacy is rising. Rachel Carson, for example, published her great Silent Spring, the leader of the environmental movement, who warned us about the cost of our use of chemicals. And she did that against great resistance. She brought this information to us, and she said to us, only within the moment of time represented by the present century has one species, man, acquired significant power to alter the nature of this world. She did that as a scientist and as a writer because she wanted to tell us the best information possible. What is the cost of our civilization? Martin Luther King Jr., leader of the American Civil Rights Movement, whom all of you know, told us something as well that's significant about the age that we were coming into now with our weapons of mass destruction. We can live together as brothers or perish together as fools. He certainly understood what the cost was of intolerance, of hatred. But now, with weapons of mass destruction, how damaging this can be to humanity. We are seeing, for the first time in human history, intensified research and support for greater knowledge and connection, and gradually, slowly but surely, and finally, the return of women to their place in the human story, right beside men, and in many ways, way beyond men in terms of their understanding of what we must do. We begin to make discoveries in science. We begin to see things increasingly. For example, we saw structure of DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, for the first time, the thing that is essentially creating and diversifying life on this planet that exists in every single living thing on this planet, whether it's a turtle or a tree or a human. We began to see this with our tools. We're gaining greater knowledge. We were gaining through our support of freedom and human rights and education and increasing literacy. Tools. This is the first transistor that will take electrons eventually and will become the basis of modern electronics. In the 1960s, for the first time, we humans, at a time of peace, look back and are beginning to see a reality of our lives that we'd never seen before, our planet. Socrates, remember he had said 25 years ago, man must rise to the top of the atmosphere and beyond. Man must rise above the earth to the top of the atmosphere and beyond, for only thus will he understand the world in which he lives. And now, in the 1960s, driven in part by the competition between the Soviet Union and the Western powers, but nonetheless at its heart, driven by the power of science and technology to go further, we put a man on the moon. We have left the planet for the first time. We are standing elsewhere. What a remarkable step this was. And we continue on exploring, going further. attempting to use our knowledge that we have gained, our powerful tools, to understand our place in the world, and maybe to enlarge our minds and understand more of how we can begin to live in a better way together on this planet. Do you know that in 1989 we saw a remarkable scene? Human rights and the recognition of the cost of war had grown to the point where we saw in just that 1 year, we saw in South Africa a black leader who had been imprisoned for 27 years by a white government. He was released from prison and became the leader of a united black and white South Africa. His name is Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela had a choice when he was released from prison. He could have sought revenge, if you will, on the white elite that had oppressed the black majority in his country. He did not. He began a period of reconciliation in his country. In Myanmar, its democratic leader, who had been under house arrest for 26 years, she was released. In Rome, the Pope, John Paul, made a trip to shake the hands and be publicly seen by the rest of the world as shaking the hands of the chief rabbi of Rome, to say that we are brothers, you and I, and the Catholic and the Christian world and the Jewish world. We come from the same original prophet. We are brothers, and we need not be in conflict. And even in the Soviet Union, it began to collapse. And in Germany, which had a wall going all the way through it that divided it between the Soviet side and the democratic side, eventually that wall came down and the Soviet Union began to fade into history. We still have threats. There is no question. We have been through, in 2001, an attack of fanaticism that we have had to come to terms with over these last years in the early part of the 21st century. We continue to exploit many peoples in the world for the materials that we need for all the modern technologies and stuff that we think we really need to have. We have our problems. 1 billion of the 8 billion on the planet today live at or below the poverty line. We have a problem with pollution, with the waste that human civilization is putting into the atmosphere. We have climate change. We have the pandemic that we're dealing with now. What I'm about to tell you is not in any way meant to say that we are out of the woods. We continue to face challenges from authoritarian leaders. But there is something I'm going to leave you with. A thought. In terms of our ability to use technology and solve our problems and go forwards and progress as a species, we happen to live in a time where we have created the ability to communicate with one another in such a way that knowledge is being shared all around the world in a golden age of learning. And that means we can do something that David Christian has helped us to see. And I'm going to leave you with this thought. David Christian, who wrote a book called Maps of Time, is like William McNeill, Arnold Toynbee, Jared Diamond, Alfred North Whitehead, many of the other free thinkers and scholars and historians I told you about. One of our most celebrated world historians today, who has pioneered a way of thinking about the planet, and it's called Big History. He has written a book about the history of the human race, set within the planet. He says this: the most important reason for hope may be that collective learning operates on a larger scale and more efficiently than ever before. If there are solutions to be found, both for humans and the biosphere as a whole, the global information networks of modern humans can surely find them. I'm going to leave you with this thought after these many lectures on the story of humanity and what we have accomplished and what we have been fraught with in human civilization, on this note of hope from someone who has studied human history in ways that can make us believe that we humans, no matter how complex, how difficult, how fraught our societies are with problems that continue to plague us, have the intelligence, have the power to solve them together.